All right. It's 2:01 Eastern, so we're going to jump in and get started. Thanks everyone for dialing in. We brought this series back for a second replay after our 1 week update on responding to reality. This is certainly a tumultuous time, and to get us through that tumultuous time, we wanted to bring together a great panel of experts to give you a perspective of what's happening in the US, what's happening in Canada, and how things are playing out. This is intended to be interactive. We welcome questions. There is a question feature in the Zoom platform. Please submit your questions along the way, and we'll do our best to get to those. The plan is to just give a quick update from each of the panelists, and then we'll jump right into Q&A. Our first speaker is Dan Utso, trade lawyer with Thompson Hine, based out of Columbus, Ohio, to give us a perspective on what's happening in the US right now, what's happened in the last month, and what is ahead for the next month. So Dan has all the answers, and I'll hand it over to him. Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Dave. I don't know about the all answers part, but it's great to see you and look forward to seeing you and the rest of the AmCham GTA chapter tomorrow when we kind of take the show on the road up in North York and for part of the mid-market activities. Andrea was saying before we got started that I have a little swoopy thing going on with my hair, and I said it's because I spend most of the day like this, just hand in my head, right, working with a lot of our companies here. But it's great to be with Andrea and our friends at Wellington and Nicole and Nicole coming in from out west here from Global Public Affairs, and in absentia or about from afar, Elizabeth, who does so much for us at GPA as part of our AmCham chapter GTA board. It's been crazy. When we came on board, every Friday, the AmCham Trade Committee has been meeting. I have the privilege to co-chair that committee, and with you, Dave, and your leadership, and Rick Taychuk and others. And we kind of have these Friday afternoon therapy sessions. And a lot of us have board meetings that go on Friday nights and throughout the weekends, or trade crises committees that companies have set up. So it's a good time. It's a good timing, not good time, good timing in terms of folks getting together to talk about these issues. But what's interesting is it's also been the cadence that it seems that the president is on. It's for the last month, it's been almost, other than the day one America First trade policy memo, where basically they've laid out everything that they've done, is that other than that, every Friday has been an announcement. It started with, of course, the IEEPA tariffs that were the border and fentanyl tariffs that came on and then were off or suspended. And then the following Friday, steel and aluminum tariffs were kind of hinted at or noticed. And so, and then reciprocals right after that. And then we had the Friday after that, where we were actually in an AmCham trade committee call where the steel and aluminum derivatives list came out and the auto tariffs were mentioned. And then last Friday, kind of to bookend that first month, the president made comments or issued a memo on digital services taxes and did the America First investment strategy. So if you really look at where the president's trade strategy is, it's been bookended on those over the past month with the America First trade policy strategy and the America First investment strategy, which is a really eye-opening document if you pour through it late Friday and throughout the weekend in terms of encouraging investment from allies, really kind of restating ally shoring, friend shoring, but also putting strict prohibitions on investment inbound from China and also outbound investment. So where are we? Last time we talked about that none of these tariffs had been announced, but the framework was there. Putting these, because we knew that there was going to be so much activity, but coming up with 3 lanes that were laid out in the America First trade policy memo, and all of that has really been confirmed. Is lane 1 is what we have called tactical tariffs or transactional tariffs, what some have called security tariffs, what our Treasury Secretary has called leverage or negotiating tariffs. Some have called them punitive tariffs, but that's the border and fentanyl. When you look at Section 4 of the America First trade policy memo, A through G is listed, in letter G, last thing in the memo, is tariffs on border for fentanyl and to deal with the southern border crises. Also on that list, letter B, is steel and aluminum tariffs. And so those are the two that we've seen. Now, the second basket is really the core of the trade strategy, which is section 2 of that memo, which is what we're talking about, reciprocal tariffs. That's where the acceleration of the USMCA negotiations are listed. That's where tariffs on automotive, semiconductors, chips, all of the things that we're hearing about, and they all get blended when the president talks, but you have to keep that first track separate from the second track. And then the third piece is China, which at the end of the day is what this is all about. So just to quickly wrap up, it's all about sequencing right now. And the reality is, for all of the activity, we haven't even started yet, is the bottom line. We haven't even started. But the border, the IEEPA tariffs, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act tariffs that were announced on February 1st and now have been suspended vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico until March 4th. Those tariffs are dealing with border and fentanyl, 10% on Canadian, energy resources. It's often said oil, it's more than oil. It's energy resources. Those will be 10%. The rest of Canada is 25% Canadian goods. And then Mexico is 25%. And then China actually got hit with tariffs of 10%. And it's amazing that we don't even talk about that, right? Like, that is a major expansion of the tariff, the scope of the tariffs already in play. But because folks had already hedged from the Trump 1.0 and because of COVID-19, that we don't even acknowledge that, like, 10%, yeah, that's moving the needle, because that 10% on China is now hitting a lot of the consumer goods that we didn't put tariffs on last time. But coming back to Canada and Mexico, number one, is, and we had predicted this last time, is that the using the IEEPA tariffs. IEEPA was not typically used. I think most folks know that, for tariffs. So there's been a lot of trade lawyers and others running around to the Canadian trade associations and running around the US that are already planning to bring legal action on IEEPA. And it's a close call whether you can do what the president has done and put those tariffs on. And that'll be something that's litigated, but by that point, it'll be over, right? The reality is we can bring trade cases unless you're going to get a temporary restraining order. If these tariffs would go on March 4th, and it's questionable whether you would get that at that point. So there is the whole litigation piece that'll be happening. But fortunately, Canada and Mexico have actually not just gone through the litigation route, they've actually taken concrete steps. And so what we've seen is various proposals, 1.3 billion, 10,000 troops on borders. The Mexicans have actually made some arrests on cartels and done a lot of the things that the Trump administration has asked for. So we are seeing progress on the security front. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security sent out questionnaires, not this past Friday, but the Friday prior, again on a Friday, asking for numbers of arrests, what numbers of interdictions, what have you been doing? And it's kind of interesting, if you saw the readout of Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump's call, interesting to compare the two readouts, one from the White House and one from PMO. It was like as if there were two different conversations. But one thing that was interesting is that the PMO, the Prime Minister's, or the PMO had said, well, arrests or incidents, interdictions of fentanyl at the border are down, which that's a good thing, right? We don't want that at the border. But what we do want to see from the US perspective is arrests behind the border up, that there should be interdictions going up. And so that's the tracking tool that Homeland Security and others are looking for, is to really look to see. The report will be published by the US Department of Homeland Security, not published for the public, but Secretary Noem, the new US Secretary of the US Department of Homeland Security, will publish her report on March 3rd for the president and say go, no go on the tariffs. And it'll ultimately be, like all things are, the president's decision. So what are the options at that point? What are we likely to see? Well, I think if you see continued progress, I think I was quoted in the media today, because I've been getting a lot of phone calls. I forgot even saying it, to be honest, which is always scary. That I think it would be overly optimistic to think that we'll say, this has been enough, tariffs are off, we're gone, we're done. The reality is that if we see progress, the best case scenario is likely these will get punted for another month, 2 months, something of that nature, which would allow that data to accrue, that you would start seeing a downtick in things like, you would see an uptick in fentanyl arrests, but and then a downtick on undocumented migrations, on fentanyl arrests at the border, fentanyl deaths. Those are the types of data elements that folks are looking at, but that's going to take time to do. So I think the other option, there's probably a million different options in between, which would be between putting those on and punting, which would be, does the president say 5% this month? And then if they continue, we'll stay at 5% if these continue, or I'm putting on 25%, but if we keep seeing improvement, I'll take them down to 10. I don't want to put ideas in their head, so let's not go down that path too much. But the key date there is March 4th. But it's also very important to remember that is a completely different track than what we're talking about on different trade issues. That's a security conversation that's happening. Steel and aluminum is in that basket, that first track. And those are the national security tariffs that we had put on. We've removed all country exemptions on the steel. So Canada and Mexico, which were some of the first out of the steel and aluminum tariffs, are back in. So those tariffs, and we upped those tariffs from 10% on aluminum to now 25%. Steel is today at 25%. And now we've expanded the list of steel and aluminum products. So it's not just rolled steel or steel that's coming out of the mill that I grew up like working in a steel mill. It's steel products. And when you look at that list, it's things that hit the automotive industry in particular, automotive fittings, which are in every automotive vehicle, trust me. And so that's a big one. And a lot of anything used in construction, going from the aluminum ladders themselves to the steel girders to the manhole cover. Somehow barbed wire is on there. I mean, didn't know that was in high demand, but a lot of barbed wire out there is on the list. But and then you can just go down the list. Anything used in construction, aluminum around window frames, door frames, etc. So significant cost to the industry. Those tariffs are scheduled to go on March 12th. And I think that's the wild card in all of this. March 12th for the products that were already on the lists, and including those that were product exclusions, things that were excluded. So the country exclusions are gone, product exclusions are gone. So right now, the scope is much broader than any of the tariffs we have seen thus far in terms of that sector. And now we have this list of derivatives. So if they were on the list before, March 12th is when they go on. If they're one of the new steel and aluminum derivatives, US CBP is still trying to figure out how they're going to process all that. And there's some real questions in there. I think the conventional wisdom is that the melted and poured, smelted and cast standard, which is where you have to go back and trace where that steel actually came out of that melted form. And there's some more technical terminology for that. The conventional wisdom right now is there's an interpretation of it that says you have to get that for everything. So every screw, nut, washer, which usually describes the trade lawyers working on these cases, but for every single one of those, you have to get that melted and poured. Not really sure that's the way I would interpret it, but we're going to wait for that direction. So, but that may come later than March 12th. Now, one of the interesting pieces is that when Canada and Mexico did their deal with the United States back, whatever, 19, when we did this, if the United States was to put those tariffs back on, or any Section 232s, they were supposed to give 60-day notice to Canada and Mexico. That's in writing. Those are side letters to the USMCA. So if you think about it, we're kicking that out about 30 days, and then maybe there'd be another 30 days after that. So again, I think the impact, the greatest impact right now on tariffs is what's going to happen with the steel and aluminum tariffs. I think it's a pick 'em right now, whether those go on or not. I think those will likely go on for parts of the world, for various parts of the world, but they may not go on for Canada and Mexico. And we're going to need to follow that closely. And also the mechanical aspects of how that steel and aluminum. And just to wrap up, of course, the president announced reciprocal tariffs. The idea, there's three parts to the reciprocal tariffs. One is just a line-by-line comparison. So Peter Navarro did an analysis, the president's advisor did an analysis back in 2019 that showed that when you compare various countries' tariff schedules to the United States, there's about 467,000 tariff lines where the other country has higher tariffs than the United States. There's about 180,000 where the US is actually higher. And then there's a bunch where we are equal. What the US is saying is if your tariffs are higher, you either come low down to us or we're coming high toward you. If you like it, it's beautiful in terms of messaging. It sounds pretty simple. How do you argue with that? But there's also some nuance to that, which is, for example, in the United States, Malaysia has around 50% tariffs on rice from the United States. we allow Malaysian rice in at 4.7%, if not lower now. But is there a lot of rice going from the United States to Malaysia? It's probably 50% because nobody ever thought to reduce it, right? So there's going to be those types of things and things that just don't make sense. So ultimately, but the second piece of that is non-tariff barriers. So that there is a public comment right now open until when? March 11th, day before the steel and aluminum tariffs, where public comments are being submitted to the United States Trade Representative on where are you U.S. companies having problems around the world, not just on line by line, but what also, this has been a very active time for a lot of us putting those comments in. And this is an opportunity for companies that may be listening to see, but I suspect things like dairy will be on that list and other types of issues. And then just to round out, or included in that will be things around the VAT. The VAT is a major issue with the European Union. And economists are going crazy because they're like, oh, it balances out import exports. But there are ways that various countries around the world manipulate VAT. We just have to acknowledge that happens. And so that those will be part of that discussion. And that report will all be produced by April 1st, along with a series of other reports. Now, the president did announce on Friday an investigation into the digital services tax, an area where AmCham Canada is right in the crosshairs on that. And then the president also announced these foreign investment changes that are happening as well. But all of those are prospective. Those are studies. The president has also opined about auto tariffs. Again, we did have a report concluded, just like we did for steel and aluminum, on auto tariffs that recommended 25% tariffs after we negotiated USMCA. But those are all kind of after this April 1st date, along with semiconductors, along with pharma. So I think all roads are, everything new that seems to be coming out, knock on wood, touch wood for our Canadian friends, is that it seems to be that this is all kind of getting punted out to that after April. But we'll really have to watch that first, that March 4th, which is really in its own lane as a security set of tariffs in the steel and aluminum. Lastly, but certainly not least, is we do expect a public comment to open on the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement as soon as our United States Trade Representative is confirmed, which will likely be, if not in a few hours, tomorrow. So he'll be confirmed. So we expect that to open on March 1st. Call for what do people want to deal with in USMCA. So if anybody's wondering, we are in the USMCA review right now as we start. And we can talk more about that, but we're going into that review with tariffs hanging over our heads on the front end. And then on the back end, because the president can always blow up USMCA within 6 months with 6 months notice. And if you remove USMCA, all of a sudden we have a bunch of line items that don't line up for reciprocal tariffs. So the default when we did the negotiation the first time was roughly about 2.5% for manufactured goods, 5% tariffs for agricultural products, with some exceptions, many exceptions to that. Now the U.S. will say, you know what, we're going to blow up USMCA and we'll figure out through the reciprocal tariffs what that's going to be. It ain't going to be 2.5%, 5%. So it's a very difficult negotiating position. And now as we transition over to our friends from Canada, the question is, who's even going to be running the show to make these decisions? So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Dave.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And a lot on the go. And my notepad is full here of dates and actions. So thanks for that recap. I want to introduce a new member of our team, Nicole Broussard from Global Public Affairs. Nicole is the vice president. She leads the Vancouver office. So she is, I guess, good morning, we should be saying to you. Good morning and welcome. We really appreciate your thoughts and comments on Dan's exact question, which is what's happening in Canadian politics right now? Who's going to be negotiating the other side of all this craziness? So, Nicole, the floor is yours. Welcome. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And thanks, Dan, for that stress-inducing overview of what's happening in the US right now. We certainly think about the US more than you think about us. So as we look forward to what's going to happen in Canada, I kind of want to do a deep dive into just the impact of the tariffs have had on our polling, on our outlook, and that question that Dan ended with is who's actually going to be running the show up here. So to give you a brief overview of what's happened, since it's been a while since we did the last one of these. So Trudeau, the Prime Minister, stepped down on January 6th as the leader of the Liberal Party, but is staying on as basically Prime Minister until March 9th, until a new leader is elected, and has prorogued the House of Commons until March 24th. So basically nothing is happening in Ottawa, really, on the ground until the House resumes on the 24th. Trump was inaugurated shortly thereafter, and then obviously the tariff conversation exploded, which has really impacted the way that the puck is headed in terms of polling right now. So what does the world look like right now in Canada with all this going on? So basically before Trudeau stepped down, the Conservatives were a shoo-in to win the next election. And so to answer Dan's question, if you were going to look back on January 5th, it was going to be Pierre Poilievre was going to be the new Prime Minister, and healthy majority, and away we go. They had about a 27-point lead over the Liberals, and if anybody knows polling, that is almost insurmountable. What happened, though, was turns out Trudeau was the problem, and with him stepping down, we saw a real significant shift in that polling. And so we're at a seventh consecutive week now of the Liberals gaining on the Conservatives, and that 27-point lead has shrunk to just under 10. I think the latest poll was last Sunday, and we've got the Conservatives only at 41 and the Liberals at 33. So depending on who you talk to and what day and what kind of polling methodology they're using, that seems to be shrinking. So what does that mean basically in terms of timing? Because that March 9th date is the leadership vote for the Liberals, and that new leader will automatically become the new Prime Minister. And with this surge in polling, I think we would be surprised also as pundits and pollsters to see numbers like that and not want to pull the pin immediately on a federal election. We've seen this happen in Ontario, where Doug Ford went through or is going through a provincial election during these tariff negotiations and does not seem to have impacted his popularity. In fact, it's only increased it. So I think the Liberals are looking at that and hoping for a similar result too. To answer that question of who will be the next Prime Minister, it's still a little bit up in the air because polls are polls, and the only poll that matters is the one on election day. But the Liberal leadership seems to be shaping up around Mark Carney. So probably a familiar name to most of you on the call today. He's the former head of the Bank of Canada, former head of the Bank of England, and is seen by Canadians to have a very strong economic message, and probably the one that can carry that fight to Trump, and seems to be the one that will win that Liberal leadership and be the next Prime Minister, maybe for a couple days, maybe for a couple weeks. What's happening here is that certainly that surge in Liberal support after Trudeau stepped down, and the anxieties that Canadians feel around kind of this existential threat from the US. Before the polling showed it was affordability, housing, safety, just the really core issues of that hierarchy of needs. But because we've got this threat now from the States that threatens all of those things, that is where the focus that all Canadians have kind of put their focus on. So we don't usually love to boo a national anthem. That's not in our that's not in our DNA. But Canadians really have loved booing the US national anthem over hockey games, and we really reveled in our win over the US this week. So there's been a real shift here in Canada, and the Liberals are benefiting from that. We're also seeing changes in Quebec. So Quebec is a very seat-rich place in Canada, 71 seats out of the 343. And so there's been some changing dynamics there, and a push towards a nationalism that we haven't seen previously. There's also been a collapse in the NDP vote as well, which seems to be swinging towards the Liberals on the left side of the spectrum. And that strategic voting conversation is really coming up in places where even members of parliament and provincial MLAs and MPPs have said that they are encouraging their folks to vote for the Liberals because it's going to stop Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, who they feel like they are less aligned with. So how are the Conservatives responding to all this? If you've got this major Liberal surge, how do you kind of deal with that? So Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservatives, has really had previously a ballot box issue on kind of the carbon tax. He's really been focused on that and really focused on the Canada is broken message. But in a time where Canada feels unified, really proud of Canada, very defensive about Canada, it does not align with our new personal narrative that we all need to stand together, Canada first, get together your task forces and your committees and let's go and let's do a national anthem and get together. So there's been a bit of a softening from the Conservatives in terms of messaging around that Canada is broken. But Mr. Poilievre certainly looked a little bit more prime ministerial in his approach. You've seen him wearing blue suits and a red tie and holding rallies with 2,000 people in downtown Ottawa, which isn't something that normally happens here in Canada. And so I think he's dressing for the job that he wants. And so I certainly wouldn't count them out of this race, even though we're seeing this surge. They're still a little bit ahead in the polls. They're still likely to form a majority government if it was going to be held today, but things can change over the next little bit. And our elections are 36 days long-ish. And so anything can happen over those 36 days. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on that. This also means for the Conservatives that there's a bit of a identity crisis in how they approach this. Because Canadians and 67% of Canadians are now either proud or very proud to be Canadian, which is quite an increase from what it was, I think, the last time they checked in 2016. That is kind of against some of the Conservative base who tends to really like Trump and really like his policies and identify with them. And so there's a bit of a, when you're trying to get elected, you want to appeal to your base, but you also want to appeal to the broader set of Canadians who are going to elect you. And so those two narratives are a little bit at odds now, where he's going to want to really focus on those conservative red meat policies, not punch too much at Trump, because he's got a section of the base that really does support Trump and like Trump, but then also appeal to the rest of Canada, who's really feeling defensive and proud to be Canadian and doesn't want to hear that we're broken. We just want to stand together. So what does this mean? To answer Dan's question, we don't quite know. Polls are polls, and I hate polls this far out because they don't really tell you much until there's a ballot box. And I can see Andrea laughing, so she knows she's been in those trenches with me for a long time. But it really does mean that this election will be tighter than I think anybody expected. I think we're going to see the pin pulled on this election shortly after the leadership concludes on March 9th. And we'll probably see a tight 36-day election, one that prevents the Conservatives, who have a mega war chest, from spending a ton of money outspending and shaping the narrative around a Mark Carney type of leader. And it also allows the Liberals to capitalize on the very kind of heightened nature of sentiment right now across the country. So it'll be still a bloodbath, as these things always are, and I think it'll be quick. So stay tuned. I basically hold on to your seats, because it's going to be a fun couple months here in Canada, and we'll be around to bring you the latest.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Appreciate that update and super helpful perspective for everyone trying to keep track of the fast-moving things on the Canadian side as well. Andrea Van Voot, who is our last of three panelists, is going to talk a little bit about the Canadian response. And Andrea, for those who don't know her, is with Wellington, and she also does work for the American Chamber of Commerce as well. And in a past life, served as the National Security and Trade Advisor for.
I get promotions every time people do this. It's the best. It was just foreign affairs and trade. You're good. All good.
Okay. Anyway, advisor for Prime Minister Harper. So Andrea understands the ins and outs of the government and how it works. So she's going to talk to us a little bit about the Canadian response to tariffs and all of the fun and games that Dan just walked through. So
Sure.
Andrea, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. I'm thrilled to be here with Nicole and Dan and you, and to visit again with everybody just a few weeks later. And, you know, as much as things change, they also stay the same. So actually, before I dive in, I'll follow up on something Nicole said, because I think she's absolutely right. The polls are a pain in the butt. They're for those of us that are involved in politics or in government, they're highly frustrating, because when you live in the bubble, you're very reactionary to them. But I think the one thing to take away from what the polls are starting to show is a trend. And the trend is that with a new leader, the Liberal Party is trending up. And that is having an impact on the significant lead that the Conservatives had over the Liberals. And so, you know, whether the polls are exactly right or not, what you are seeing is an absolute rise for the Liberals. So, you know, I totally agree with Nicole. I think that the Liberal Party and if Mark Carney is the winner, is really right to capitalize on that momentum and that upward trend and trajectory, because it would be bad to let the Conservatives spend a whole whack of money branding Mark Carney in their own way, because they do have a pretty significant war chest. So I'll just put a pin in that, and I say all of that even as a conservative watching what's going on. Just to give a little bit of a sense as to, okay, you know, the US has got a pretty aggressive agenda with regard to tariffs. We've heard about tariffs against Canada and the United States relating to what is essentially border security. We've heard about the steel aluminum tariffs. We've heard about tariffs in terms of reciprocal trade. What does all this mean? I think what's important for us to take away, because it's going to change, right? It's going to keep changing. The goalposts of the president's demands and his asks are going to keep changing, because the tariffs are great leverage to use against trading partners. What does all of this mean? What it means is that if the United States continues to believe that in some way their trading partner is not towing the line, filling their part of the deal, being balanced, that the president will either continue to threaten tariffs so that we will do what he wants, or not. And he will impose those tariffs. And that's particularly related to what Dan mentioned in his opening, relating to USMCA. So I think what I would observe just from what we've experienced with the United States and as Canada is that these threats regarding tariffs are not going away. And we should settle in and to some extent, not accept the tariffs in any way, but accept the fact that this threat, this regular threat, this constant threat isn't going to stop. And I think once we're able to accept that, that then helps inform our response. And our response, I think, is what Dave has asked me just to quickly touch on. And I think it's an important thing for all of us as part of the call to keep in mind, because not only are there the impacts of what the president is threatening with regard to the implication of, or the imposition of tariffs, but it is also the implications of Canada's reaction to those tariffs. And the premiers and the prime minister and the federal cabinet have, shortly after the president had his sort of first very serious threat against Canada, announced a series of retaliatory threats and messages around, not considering U.S. headquartered companies for certain procurement initiatives in Canada. I would characterize our response, the Canadian response, is almost twofold. One is there's the domestic response, and the other is the international response, the Canada-U.S. response. So the Canada-U.S. response is, okay, well, we're going to announce a number of retaliatory tariffs on products of consequence, political consequence for American entities. And we are going to reconsider whether or not we're going to allow U.S. headquartered companies to bid on procurement projects in Canada. And even some of those procurement projects in Canada, we're going to think about whether or not we continue with them. There was that response. Then there was also a domestic response, which I have to say, as Canadians, I'm not overly proud of, which was, goodness, this threat certainly brings to light the fact that Canada needs to really get its house in order, right? This conversation around internal trade, the conversation around reducing taxes, the conversation around the cost of doing business in Canada. It is, I guess, frustrating to me that it took a serious threat from a major ally for us to reflect on the fact that we needed to get our house in order. And I don't think that's a particularly great look when we say to the United States, you know, and just you wait until we do get our domestic house in order, and then we'll be even stronger. You know, look, I am very happy for those improvements to be made domestically. I feel very strongly about the need for Canada to be as competitive as possible. We're that much stronger a partner for the United States if we are stronger. But I wish that realization, or that taking up that mantle, was not something that came as a result of a serious trade threat from the United States. So there is that. In that work, there was some policy announced by the federal government on Friday to remove a number of interprovincial trade barriers, which is all great. The second piece, though, was retaliation and retaliatory threats, political consequence to the United States, and this procurement piece. Again, not a great look when our premiers come out, or our provinces come out and say, I am going to, you know, stop the Starlink procurement. I am going to get our officials to look at whether or not, you know, we can reconsider any of our existing contracts. This is, I understand the need to fight back in this way, but this is not this is not how you respond or react to a threat from someone like President Trump. But I also recognize that Canadian politicians believe, and certainly Premier Ford has indicated that, you know, he believes he needs a mandate from the people to have a firm ground to stand on in his response to the president in this therefore called a U.S. election. So we will threaten, you know, certain retaliatory tariffs, and we will threaten with the reconsideration of procurement. On the other hand, what did stop the imposition of tariffs shortly after the beginning of February, it was a response to the president's ask to cooperate on security issues of concern to the U.S. So he expressed a concern about border security. We responded with measures to enhance our border security. Tariffs weren't imposed. While I don't love the perception of cooperating in terms of these sorts of threats, I do think that it's important to keep this in the back of our mind and to understand truly what it is that the president is trying to achieve, and how we can help achieve that while ignoring the rhetoric and drama and theater of what's going on. And the more we can avoid drawing ourselves into the drama and the theater of these threats, I think the better our negotiations and our coming negotiations will be with the president. The more we escalate the theater and drama, the worse it will become, I fear. And at the end of the day, it will only actually hurt Canada. This is particularly so as we enter the USMCA negotiations. We need to take the temperature down on this, and make sure that as we're entering the USMCA negotiations, that we also have a clear agenda for what it is that the president is looking for. This is the problem with negotiating with someone whose demands change quite constantly. Maybe just one final point. As a person who is closely involved in the negotiations of almost all of our free trade agreements, I love that there is a renewed conversation about diversification. If there's anything that the last few months have reminded us, is the importance for Canada to have a diversified set of markets for our goods. I just wish it didn't come to this. This sort of goes back to my first comment about our domestic reaction around internal trade and, you know, addressing issues of competitiveness. I view diversification and market diversification in the same bucket. I think that we need to realize that that is in Canada's best interest and something that we should be pursuing, unfortunately, in particular in light of what's happening with the president. So I expect, though, unfortunately, that much of the rhetoric will continue and come back as we see renewed threats or commitments from the United States to impose tariffs. So I think on that part, on that point, Dave, I will pause there, and we should go to the questions, because we know that's where everybody prefers to spend their time anyways.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Andrea. That was a great recap of kind of what is happening and how things are working behind the scenes. And I think the point that's really well taken is just not escalating and skyrocketing the tensions. We do have several questions, and I'm gonna kind of jump through these quickly. The first one, this is from John Tennant. Media reports say the U.S. may impose tariffs on Canadian software exports to the U.S. I'll start maybe with you, Dan, if you've heard anything about this, and even if or how that might theoretically work.
Well, the
U.S.
mechanic-
tariffs on Canadian software exports.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, everything's subject to tariffs right now. If the IEEPA tariffs go on, but I think there is talk around that with the DST. And then, of course, if we're talking about, taxing, digital transactions, right? If that kind of software, downloading, uploading, streaming, et cetera. I think that, but that it would be a mechanism. It's being discussed, is my understanding, but as part of this overall package of potential leverage tariffs. But those are more negotiating tariffs, because look, the U.S. stated position, it's been made clear by all members of the administration during their confirmation hearings, that the U.S. policy is to have an extended period to actually extend and formalize that there will be no tariffs on no customs fees, duties on any digital transactions, and which is the law of the land right now as it is, but they want that formalized into a multilateral agreement. So that's the stated policy of now what they'll do in as a mechanism to address DST and others. And I think there is some talk around 301s looking at that. But any of these additional tariffs, I mean, these are all going to be anything that's kind of added on to Canada now is to create additional negotiating topics in the USMCA discussion. And so that's where, and that's hopefully the basket these things are in. I think that's probably better for everybody if they stay in that basket, but we're in that now. And I think that's the point I would emphasize to people. I actually have a question for Nicole and Andrea, which is just based on everything can I ask that question, Dave, or just based on everything you guys have just said, guys in the Midwest sense, the gender neutral sense, but since the trajectory politically has been positive for a certain party, that's the government of Canada right now, since those threats, what's the incentive to resolve any of these issues before the election? Like who, like if President Trump came out right now and said, you know what, those March 4th tariffs, you guys have done enough. Who does that help? Like, is that helpful? Or does it like, oh, okay, like maybe we overreacted here? Like, I'm just questioning, like, is there any incentive to resolve this issue until there's an election?
I guess Nicole, maybe I would want to ask you a question back. Resolve what problem? Which problem are we solving? Which one?
You have two major baskets of tariffs. You have large restructuring of global trade. Like if the president just said, hey, you know what, this is cool. I've got enough now. Doesn't that, who wins in that situation? How does that play out in Canadian political world?
If the president were to say, I'm good, you did everything I wanted?
Let's just take March 4th. I'm taking those off the table. Steel and aluminum are still out there. Canada, I want to change quota. I want to change, the 27 times 20. We set the quotas at 2017, even though we didn't call them quotas, but that's what they are. I want to rejigger those numbers a little bit, add a few more to the derivatives, but that'll be enough. And then let's go into a year and a half discussion on USMCA. Who does that help?
I don't think it matters because he's still got another 4 years left in the tank, and we are not sure that this is the end of this. So even if he says March 4th, you know what? Love the new leader. great, let's go ahead hand in hand towards the sunset. I don't think anyone's going to believe that. And so even if this round is resolved, I think there's just like an impending doom and an anxiety around the table these days that we cannot trust what happens. Like, we can trust Twitter and what he says is like the truth, but I don't think it really changes the game that much.
I think what Nicole just said is really, really important. It's now a matter of trust. There is not a single Canadian, and I think this is a real problem. There isn't a single Canadian right now that believes that until the day he is out of office, that this threat is over. And that's a problem, because how do you negotiate in that context? If you think that the threat is always around the corner, that there is nothing you can do that will ever satisfy him, that despite even negotiating an entire free trade agreement with him, that he can in a moment decide that that is without value, then how do you negotiate with that? How are you ever certain? And so that is now a sentiment that exists amongst Canadians and politicians that I think is exactly to Nicole's point. I don't think, even if Trump were to be like, cool, that Canadians would sigh, would have a sigh of relief.
Fair. Thanks. Jumping back
Dan wants
into
to argue at that point, but that's okay.
No, I want to jump back into the questions from the group.
Sure.
Dan, you've had your one allotted question, so one more from you. Ian Brown this time. Could someone please comment on China's response and what that means for Canadian trade and investment for China? I think, Dan, you're probably best positioned on the first part of this, at least. China's response to date and what that means. And then we'll go to Andrea for the Canadian, what it means for Canadian investment for China.
Yeah, I'll just be real quick. I mean, China's in, they know they're in for the long haul right now, right? So this is going to be an effort. They've retaliated in a very measured way, responded to the original 10%, at least in trade law terms, that it was measured. It wasn't a full scale assault, which last time we had I always called that tranche 3, list 3 that we had as the no you didn't tariffs, because we had 50 billion that we were arguing about in list 1 and list 2. And then China retaliated, we're like, no you didn't, and then we just threw the kitchen sink in that list 3 tranche. And so and so I think China knows that there's going to be a long haul. But look, the president is in legacy mode, right? I mean, he's not exaggerating when he said, many people are saying this, that the president wants a peace prize, right? A Nobel Peace Prize, and he wants to deal with China. And the question, but he's going to put maximum leverage on, and that's where he is. And how that plays out with the rest of the world, I think that, but I do say, the argument that people will make to this administration, which is all you're doing is pushing your allies closer to China. The response of the United States is good luck with that. Good luck with that. Because if we're the most powerful economy in the world, the largest economy in the world, and we have a tough time dealing with them, good luck. How's that working out for everybody else that made a deal with them? And you can go, but I mean, that's their position. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying that's what you're going to hear back. So like that doesn't resonate with those folks. It just doesn't resonate.
But I think, Dan, I think there's a question now amongst some of your allies as to whether or not you are going to be the most important economy in the future, and whether or not all of these steps that the president is taking are to address that problem and to reassert the United States exceptionalism in that respect, or will actually hurt and weaken the US economy. And I'm not actually sure that the answer is clear yet. I'm not sure that we know what the implication of this is going to be. But I think you are 100% right. I think that for me, the thing about the tariffs that were imposed in the beginning of February, and one of the most interesting things to me was about the fact that it actually got imposed against China, and not against Canada and Mexico. But I do think you're absolutely right. There is a big, big trap here for countries. And the trap is, if you want to play ball with the United States, you can't play ball with China. On the other hand, if the United States is such an unpredictable trading partner, then how do you avoid markets like China? And I think there's a real trap in that for political leaders who are going to search for an answer of what to do with their exports in a very uncertain period. And that could be a very painful trap to find themselves in.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I'm going to jump into the Q&A with a somewhat related question. This one is from Barry Wright. You know, how much does the EU play in into future decisions coming out of the White House, as the EU is a stronger import-export partner for Canada, and a potential US target for tariffs, et cetera, down the road? Start with you, Andrea, and then we'll comment on get Nicole's comments.
I'm really conflicted on this because I was so close to the Canada-EU free trade negotiations, and I feel very strongly about the importance of that trade relationship. On the other hand, it's probably one of the saddest things for me, the utilization rates of the free trade agreement. And why is that? I have lots of reasons as to why that is, but I don't think that those issues are going to get addressed over the next couple of months to be that response to the United States. It's very interesting to me that the US hasn't put tariffs on the EU as of yet. It's curious to me that his attention is so directly focused on Canada and Mexico and not on Europe, although I think that a lot of that has to do with China, frankly, and the threat that the president feels exists from China via Canada and Mexico. But I don't think that a lot of our trade issues are solved necessarily by Europe, unfortunately. I also think I haven't thought this through enough yet, but I do think that what the president is doing with regard to Russia and Ukraine is a different engagement with Europe that is quite different than the tariff fight. There's a different geopolitical game going on there. That it's not economic. So I wish that Europe was more of an answer. I wish it was a stronger answer. Today, it isn't, and that is personally heartbreaking.
Thanks.
I agree with everything that Andrea just said. And also, I think from the Canadian perspective, we also need to get our own house in order before we can start going and looking at diversifying our trading partners and strengthening those relationships that maybe didn't come to fruition, as Andrea said. Like, we're definitely looking at the Asia Pacific region more closely. We've got a couple trade missions going over there too, but I think that should be the focus of the next Prime Minister in Canada, is just to break down those interprovincial trade barriers and then start going out on missions to find some nice partners to work with that aren't just the US, because that is what Canadians want. They want to see these relationships built with the EU, with more Asia Pacific region. So, but we got a lot of work to do at home first.
Yeah, I think that plays into like the productivity numbers for Canada and all of our regulations challenges there that we just heard about those in the I don't want to foreshadow the US Business Confidence in Canada survey, but some of those topics came out loud and clear, to your point. Gonna jump back into the chat here. This is from Orchid Pollitt. Has there been any official or unofficial indication from the US side regarding the specific HS codes expected to be covered under the potential upcoming tariff implementations in March or April, March/April, particularly concerning imports from Canada, the EU, and China? Dan, as soon as I see
mean,
HS
look,
codes, I go directly to you.
On the IEPA tariffs, it's every HS code. That's easy.
Yeah.
You know, on the steel and aluminum, yes, the HS codes have all been listed as of last Friday, or a couple of Fridays ago now. The HS codes on the steel and aluminum derivatives are all out. And those touched on the areas that I mentioned. And so those are all out. Now, on the line items, you know, what nerds like me just do or go back and forth and look at what the potential tariff codes are on the reciprocal tariffs and look at what those line items are where there are differentials. Again, there's 460,000 of them. And so, you know, that would be the place to look. I just want to add on this. I'm not going to get into, because I think there's two important points because it's come up now several times, which is the president's an unpredictable trading partner. The US asks we never know what he's going to ask. These asks are nothing new. They're nothing new. They were asked by the Biden administration as well on things like dairy, on things like steel and aluminum, right? The Biden administration put additional measures on Mexico because Mexico was arguably being the backdoor for steel. Like fentanyl and the border are not new discussions, right? They were talking about, the Biden administration was talking about using the good regulatory practices. I think what the argument is that the president's actually willing to use tariffs and the tone and tenor of 51st state, right? Nobody had on their big, I think those of us in North America knew we'd be hearing the word sovereignty this year, but we didn't think it'd be coming from Canada. We thought it'd be coming from south of the border, which is really the contrast to Mexico's response to this, to Canada's response to this. Mexico's not negotiating this in the media every day. They're not running to Washington every week. Now, certain people are, but they seem to be the ones moving the ball farther down the road. And I think there may be some lessons there a bit to see where things are. But none of this matters on the trade side, to Andrea's earlier point, is if the US, the most important issue right now on all of this is what's going on with the bills going through Congress on the tax cuts, on unleashing American energy, the reconciliation bills. The Senate has one bill that, or is looking at two bills. The House has one bill. If we don't get, we're talking about the sticks right now. If we don't talk about the carrots, which are actually unleashing the US economy, unleashing energy, unleashing, streamlining regulations, et cetera, and giving folks a tax cut, or extending those tax cuts, particularly to corporate, which that'll be a huge issue for Canada if the US actually gets its tax rate where we think it's going to go, or the president wants it to go. Like, if you can't do that, and that's good, those are going to be huge fights in Congress with a 2 to 5 vote majority, right? Like, if you can't do that, then all this tariff stuff just becomes pain for the United States, right? So you have to have both, and I think that's what the administration's saying right now is, hey, give us a break right now on this, but we're focused now on the economic, wins right now. The tariffs, this is just the beginning, as I said. This is going to play out. We're watching the reconciliation more than anything, because that's what matters in most corporate boardrooms right now beyond the tariffs. So,
yeah. Thanks, Dan. I'm going to direct this one to Andrea real quick. From Kevin Jacoby. I think we've sort of touched on this, but is this just about tariffs or is it about Canadian sovereignty? It's a lot of the rhetoric, 51st state. I'm not going to repeat the whole question, but the damage is happening now. What's your response to that? And then Dan, you can speak maybe to what limitations there are in the US government to rein in rhetoric. Yeah.
So, gosh, there's so many things I'd like to say about this question because I think it's so important. If I'm talking about what I think is going on behind the scenes, I think, and I mean this without any partisanship whatsoever, I believe that the president really does not like the prime minister. And I believe that the president really does not like the Liberal Party as the prime minister led it. And I believe that a lot of the rhetoric that is coming from the president around 51st state was to embarrass, humiliate, tear down, whatever, that political office. Do I think that is becoming of a president? Really, I suppose none of my business. He's not my president. Do I think it is backfiring in Canada? Yes. Do I wish that he would stop? Because it would give us a lot more space to negotiate and a lot more room to negotiate in a much more constructive adult fashion. To respond to what may very well be legitimate concerns from the president, it absolutely would. But what he's doing by continuing is actually, he's going to make it very, very hard for Canadian politicians to negotiate with him because Canadians are so, and it's backfiring in an unfortunate way. Canadians are so anti-American right now. It was a sentiment that started during COVID. It's back. And as you're seeing with what is very unprecedented behavior of Canadians at the hockey games, the booing stuff, that is bad. But ideally back off on the 51st state, unless what you're talking about is a customs union, and then just say that that's what you're looking for, and we would happily talk about that.
Great. Well, we are up against the clock. It's 3 p.m. Thanks to Nicole for joining. She had to jump for another event. She's in high demand. Thanks to Dan and Andrea. This was a great conversation. We're looking to put our next one together for March 31st so that everyone will be able to formally log their predictions for the April 1st report. And we'll see where everything lands. Thanks again for tuning in. Whatever we can do to help, we're here to help out. So please reach out to us at the American Chamber, and we'll do our best to assist you in any way we can. Thanks, guys.